almost exactly 12 months ago. And when God gave me this, he gave me a vision and he gave me this word, and I understood it and I recorded it on my computer and I looked at it and studied it and I was happy with that, but there was nothing in me that said I should do anything with it. How interesting, because I thought, you've given this word, it's clearly from you, and you think, well, I better do something with it. But there was nothing in me wanting to do anything with it. And so it had stayed in my computer, and I think I've probably looked at it once or twice over the years since then. It stayed in the computer, just resting there. When I got home Wednesday night and talked to God, God says, that scripture. And I went, what? What did you think that one a year ago? Yes, he said. And it's taught me, when God gives you something, there are two parts to it. One is understand what he's given you. Part two is wait for the moment in history that he's decided to put it into the world. Timing is everything, somebody said. It is. And so I'm quite fascinated, if that's the right word to use. As I share this, I want you to remember that God gave this 12 months ago. And the reason I want you to remember that is when you spot something which is to do with this instant today, realise that God prepared the answer 12 months ago. Just keep reminding yourself of that as we go through here. And are we up here, Bram?
Yeah, do you want that one?
Oh yeah, please. We're on PowerPoint.
I'll put it up, yeah.
As we will see, this referendum, we've had endless debates, etc. about it, and we've heard brilliantly from Angela this morning about it. And I thought, well, we don't need to hear any more, but God gave us some direction looking forward from here in the year 1048 BC. 1048 years before Jesus. This scripture I'm going to share took place. And it's in there, it has some indication of what to do now, looking forward. Isn't that interesting? You talk about God preparing something a year in advance, so that's 3,048 or something years ago. Absolutely incredible. So, well done. Thank you, Brian. Will this work?
Working?
Not.
Not working?
Don't know. No?
No.
You got your thing on? You got
Okay, I'll come out of that one and we'll do it a different way.
You're in PowerPoint?
I was in PowerPoint. Don't work. Right, okay. Now let's go in that one.
Whilst we get that ready, if you want to look at scripture as we go through, the scripture is in the first book of Samuel, and we're going to be looking at chapters 13 and 14 as we go through. So, you restarting?
Come on. Come on.
Let's just begin, whilst Brian's doing that, to read chapter 13 of 1 Samuel. This wasn't where I was going to start, but whilst we're doing this, we can just get ahead a little bit. So I'll quickly read through all of chapter 13. So we need to move fast just to get through these scriptures, all right? So Saul reigned 1 year, and when he'd reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose for himself 3,000 men of Israel, 2,000 in the mountains of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. The rest of the people he sent away every man to his tent. So, this is at the start of Saul's reign. He's 2 years in, and he pulls together a group of 3,000 men. And Jonathan attacked the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. Then Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land. We did that last week, didn't we? Notice? Then Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." Now all Israel heard it said that Saul had attacked the garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel had also become an abomination to the Philistines. And that word abomination means Israel had become, the other word they use is odious. Yeah? To the Philistines. And the people were called together to Saul at Gilgal. Then the Philistines gathered together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen and people, as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. And they came up and encamped in Michmash to the east of Bethaven. When the men of Israel saw that they were in danger, for the people were distressed, another word for that was they were frightened stiff, then the people hid in caves, in thickets, in rocks, in holes and in pits. And some of the Hebrews crossed over the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. Then he waited 7 days according to the time set by Samuel, but Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So Saul said, I will just jump through. There's a section here about Saul burning the offering that he shouldn't do. And Samuel tells him off about that, because Samuel then comes, says in verse 10, "Now it happened as soon as he had finished presenting the burnt offering that Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him, that he might greet him." If we jump down then to verse 15. Then Samuel, this was now they were in Gilgal, arose and went from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin, which is where Jonathan was. And Saul numbered the people present with him, about 600. Do you remember what number they started with? 3,000. 2,400 had left, leaving 600. Saul, Jonathan his son, and the people present with them remained in Gibeah of Benjamin, but the Philistines encamped in Michmash. Then the raiders came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned onto the road to this place, to the land of that place, and another company turned to the road to this other place. And another company turned to the road of the border that overlooks the valley of Zeboim towards the wilderness. Now, there were no blacksmiths to be found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, "Lest the Hebrews make swords and spears." But all the Israelites would go down to the Philistines to sharpen each man's plowshare, his mattock, his axe and his sickle. And the charge for a sharpening was a pin for the plowshares, the mattocks, the forks and the axes, and to set the points of the goads. So it came about on the day of the battle that there was neither sword nor spear to be found in the hand of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan. How many of them? And what didn't they have? Okay. Interesting, isn't it? But they were found with Saul and Jonathan, his son. And the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash. So that's the first part of this story. Oh, well done. So now we can just flip back. Now we've read that. This is like part 1. And when, a year ago now, God plonked this picture into my mind. I saw this shallow metal bowl. This was as close as I could get to it. It was made of dark brown metal, like bronze or copper, and it was about 12 inches in diameter and had a large flat edge to it. But the bowl I saw was filled with oil. That one isn't. I couldn't find one on Google or wherever. And I said to the Lord, "What's this bowl then, Lord?" Just a simple picture like that. And he said to me, This bowl represents every child of mine here. Now, he said it where I was at the time, but today he's saying this represents every child of mine here. The bowl is their spirit, and I have filled them already over and over again with oil. The oil of my spirit to refresh them, to guide them, to bless them. And I thought, oh good, yeah, I know that, Lord, thank you, praise you God, da da da. But I'm thinking, so what? No, I didn't say that to him, but you know, sometimes you do. You think, oh yeah, I get that, Lord, what's next? So, isn't it interesting how God can pull things in from different directions? Here's me thinking about a bowl of oil, and what does he do? But he plonks into my mind this story of Jonathan and his armour bearer that you find here in the first book of Samuel. And this is a year ago. So let's just have a look at this, since God showed it to me. Have I got? Oh, yes, I have. So this particular story happens in the first couple of years of Saul's reign here. You see, 1048 was the date I quoted you just now. That's because I looked at this diagram too. But I just want you to see before here this gap. This gap started when Samson dies. Remember Samson pulling down the temple and killing the Philistines? Well, that happens back here, right? And there is a gap here of 30, 40 years or so. And if you look into that gap, you'll see that the Philistines had conquered Israel. And when Samson died, there was no judge left to look after Israel. In fact, Samson, of course, was in prison a few years before the end of his life as well. There was nobody looking after Israel and fighting for them. There was a gap. And the Philistines took that opportunity to subjugate Israel, to dominate them. They had suppressed Israel. In fact, they had planted garrisons throughout Israel with their armies spread around, and we'll talk about one in Geber actually in a minute. All right? They had forced Israel into obedience to Philistine rules, and we just read that actually they were scared that Israel might rise up again. And so they'd taken all of the blacksmiths out of the country and forced Israel to come to Philistine or Philistia or perhaps to one of the garrisons whenever they wanted. Even their ploughshares, their axes, anything that was made of metal and needed to be sharpened, they had to go to the Philistines to get it sharpened. Those were the rules the Philistines applied. And what's more, they had to pay for the privilege. Recognise that? And doing that, Philistines had taken away the power of Israel to fight. That's why Saul's army had no spears, no swords, apart from a couple. Because Israel had become subservient and indeed cowed under the rule of the Philistines. And I want you to look at that and say, can you see that today? Because what had the Philistines done? Not only taken away their swords and their spears, but had forced Israel to come to them for anything to do with their agriculture, their farming, their industry. They were reliant on the Philistines sharpening their tools and enabling those things therefore to run. Recognise that? So, let's have a quick look, just to remind ourselves. Thanks, stay still, Bright, thank you. This was the land of the Philistines here, down the west coast here. Here's Jerusalem, this is the Mediterranean. So this is their area, and if you remember, we talked about the valley of Sorek, which ran here. We talked about that some time ago. Oh, stay still, Brian, please. Yeah, I can't reach up there otherwise. This was their area. The story we're talking about happens up here. Stay still. Thank you. Stay still. Here. This is Michmash, and here's Gibeah. And as we read earlier, we knew that something happened, and the big force of the Philistines came up there, and they did it by coming up through here and coming across here past this place called Beth Aven. There's a route here through Ajalon, runs from there, across this mountainous area to reach that place. Okay, so this is where we're going to look, but just remember where the homeland of the Philistines were, all over there. But the Philistines had spread themselves out and were ruling over Israel, yes? So, there's this army of Israel which Saul has pulled together. But in fact, if we look at it, can you close that in, please, Brian? Could you just leave it, not expand it anymore? Just leave it as it is, just so I can point to things. It needs to come in further. Is that maximum? Thank you. Can you leave it like that? Thank you. So here we are. Here's Jerusalem. Yeah, and the Philistines are down there. This army of Israel, for some reason, had split into two camps. Tick. Notice? One camp with Saul in it based themselves in Michmash. The other part, led by Jonathan, based themselves in Gibeah. Jonathan decides he is going to attack the enemy. Not Saul, Jonathan. And they attack this garrison here, this purple one, at Geba. Notice that? Geba. Watch what happens. It says, we just read it, it says when he did that, it doesn't say he wiped that out. It says it attacked it. And it then says the Philistines heard about it. Remember where they live? All the way down southwest? Word very quickly went down there and said, do you see what Jonathan's done? What do? It actually says, we read it very quickly, that the Philistines gathered themselves together, just like the 5 founding partners to the EU are just doing exactly the same, bringing themselves together, and then they march out via Beth Aven and head towards Michmash. So they come across the top here, towards here. What is very obvious is Saul's army, and indeed lots of Jonathan's, were very scared, extremely fearful. How big was this army? We did really very quickly go over the numbers. Do you remember that we had 3,000 of Saul's army in total, which reduced to 600? The Philistine army, there was some debate about the numbers. it ranges between 10,000 and 36,000, depending on how you interpret the Hebrew. So if it was 10,000, you've got a roughly 20 to 1 ratio. If it's 36,000, you've got 70 something? 70 to 1. Massive, huge. I'm not surprised they were frightened. And don't forget, that army of 36,000 were fully equipped. The 600 had plowshares, forks, knives. Ragtag army, really, wasn't it? Yeah? It's interesting to look at that. It's not surprising they felt frightened. They were incredibly fearful. And Saul and his bunch just lose it altogether. And they decide, I'm out of here. And they come down to, well, Gilgal was either here or here. I have a feeling it's there, but I'll tell you why in a moment. But anyway, they move, they come down here to the lower land, off that high ground, down to Gilgal. They're trying to get away. And it says they hide in holes, hide in caves, hide in thickets. Some of them even rushed across the Jordan to get away. That's why the numbers started to go down. And they're basically carrying down at Gilgal, frightened of what the Israelites had done in Jonathan and what the Philistines might do to them. That is where we are today. Can you sense the fear of what's going to happen next? In fact, you were talking about it. Yeah? So then what happens? The prophet didn't look up where he came from, but the prophet Samuel comes finally to Gilgal. Now, there's a section there we won't bother with today about him having an argument with Saul, but he does finally come to Gilgal. Yeah? And what does Samuel do then? Samuel then himself leads the way, and he goes and walks from there to here. And when he does, all the remaining soldiers go with him to here. They follow Samuel. Finally, God's in the camp. Yeah? But only 600 men in total. But what's happened is the scene is now set, as Angela said, for actually the real battle that's going to come. They have changed the way they have positioned themselves. And now, you've got one army standing in one place, one position. That's where we are, that's where we were on Friday morning. One country had made one clear decision, standing in one place against the enemy. So, let's just have a look at that. That's where they were. So here you see they've both come together now. Here. And where's the Philistine army has come across the top there, and they've planted themselves where Saul originally was, in Michmash, which is slightly higher ground, actually. Let's look at what that looks like. Here is an actual picture of that area today. So, here's Geba, just off of here, and Gibeah was just below that. Here's Michmash, and the Philistine army had come across here to reach Michmash. You can see it was rather difficult going through there, and I don't think they wanted to go through here. But they planted themselves here, and Jonathan and Saul were now based here. And this area is called the Pass, the Michmash Pass, because it's slightly easier going up that route than north or south, in fact. Just remember that picture. That's where the battle was set ready to rage. So now let's quickly look at part 2. And when we got to that point, or when I got to that point, I said, why are you bringing this up right now? Because what I've done in terms of the connections, I didn't understand a year ago. I just had the story. And so I went through it, I thought, hang on, that is exactly what's happened today. Wow, Lord, your timing is amazing. Ha! And I said, so Lord, so why are you showing me this? Because I can see the analogies, I can see the comparisons with today's situation with the EU. I can see that. Thank you, Lord. Why are you showing it? And he said, because that, and where I've just reached, is exactly where you are today in this land. If you heard Angela, the battle has only just started. So God then said, I've showed you it because I want you to see, looking forward now, what happens in this battle. So let's just quickly look at the next chapter. I'll try and read fast. Chapter 40. Now it happened one day that Jonathan the son of Saul said to the young man who bore his armour, come, let's go over to the Philistine garrison that is on the other side. Remember, the other side? Yeah? But he didn't tell his dad. And Saul was sitting, in fact, back at Gibeah, slightly lower down. And there were about 600 men there. So we've got the same numbers again. And it talks about who was the actual Lord's priest. And then moving on to verse 4. Between the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistine garrison, there was a sharp rock on one side and a sharp rock on the other side. And the name of one was Bozez, and the name of the other was Senna. And these are known here, these very steep sides to this deep gorge that runs through there. Here, these are known as the Bozez and Senna cliffs. Today. Now we don't know exactly where this next part of the story happened. I doubt if it was just there, but it might have been somewhere just here that we go through this next part of the story. Verse 6. Then Jonathan said to the young man who bore his armour, come, let's go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised Philistines. It may be that the Lord will work for us. It may be. It may be that the Lord will work. It may be that the Lord will work for us. Do you think we're absolutely certain? It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few. So his armour bearer said to him, do all that is in your heart. Go then, here I am with you, according to your heart. Then Jonathan said, very well, let's cross over to these men and we'll show them ourselves. If they say this to us, wait until we come to you, then we'll stand still in our place and not go up to them. But if they say thus, come up to us, then we will go up. For the Lord has delivered them into our hands, and this will be a sign to us. So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, look, the Hebrews are coming out of their holes where they've hidden. Then the men of the garrison called to Jonathan into his armour, hands and knees with his armour bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan, and he came after him, his armour bearer killed them. That first slaughter which Jonathan and his armour bearer made was about 20 men within about half an acre. And there was trembling in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. That's in the Philistine garrison. The garrison and these raiders that had gone out trembled. The earth quaked, so that it was a very great trembling. Now the watchman of Saul in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and there was the multitude of the Philistine army melting away, and they went here and there. And jumping down to verse 19, it happened while Saul talked to the priests that the noise which was in the camp of the Philistines continued to increase. Yeah? Verse 20. And they went to battle, that's Saul, then joined in this battle. And every man's sword, that's the Philistine sword, because the Israelites didn't have any. Yeah? And every man's sword was against his neighbour, and there was very great confusion. Moreover, the Hebrews who were with the Philistines before that time, who came up with them into the camp from the surrounding country, they also joined the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan, and likewise all the men of Israel who'd hidden in the mountains. When they heard that the Philistines fled, they also followed hard after them in battle. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle shifted to Beth-aven. Do you remember I said they came up from the west via Beth-aven? They are now retreating westwards through Beth-aven and Ajar as well. Yeah. So let's look at that. I don't think this is the best picture, really, but it's a picture. There was a young armour bearer with Jonathan, pictured here on his left, on the left. He's perhaps not very experienced, and perhaps not very strong, although he does, looks like it. And perhaps with insufficient personal armour. Remember, they didn't have blacksmiths, couldn't make stuff out of metal much. So whilst Jonathan's got some on the right, the armour bearer hasn't. Now, he may have been working with Jonathan for some time, we don't know, or it may have been a short time. And perhaps he hoped that one day he'd be able to act like one of these mighty warriors in Israel. You know, perhaps he thought, yeah, I'll learn, I'll become one of those. But maybe he thought he didn't have what it took to lead men into battle, like Jonathan. Now, normally, in a battle, the armour bearers were like bystanders when the real battle took place. They would follow closely behind, in this case Jonathan, and they would quite often just mop up afterwards and kill whoever, in this case Jonathan, had wounded, if they hadn't killed them outright. So they'd be mopping up out afterwards, yeah? I think of myself like that, funny enough. So the first question, are there any armour bearers here today? I mean in this room. I'm not talking about England, although it applies to them as well. Are there any armour bearers here today? And that means you're happy to be amongst the army, but not actually take part in the battle. I think maybe I'm a bit like that. Not, if you like, believing I have what it takes to join in the big work. And you know, if somebody said, I want 5 volunteers out of you 20 for God's work, then I'm likely to be one of the 15 people who take a smart step backwards, leaving 5 people at the front. Don't say, oh, I heard that. Did you hear that? Here, we have an agreement on that at least. I did hear that. Love you. I'll talk to you afterwards. However, when Jonathan declares his intention to attack the Philistines, something stirs up in the armour bearer. Is it fear? I'm sure there's a bit of that. Self-doubt? I'm sure there was a lot of that. Concern for safety? Probably as well. But something else as well. You know, suddenly, inside this armour bearer, the Spirit of God stirs in him also. And he cries out inside himself, I can imagine, I don't want to be a bystander. I want to knock the enemy back too. I want to be part of this too. I want to make a stand for God too. I don't feel I can do it on my own. This is like me. But I can support other people. And I want to say, I'm with you in this. And take part. And I may not be able to lead, but I think I can follow and do my bit. And so the armour bearer steps up and says to Jonathan, my heart is like your heart in this. Where you go, I'll go. And what you do, I'll be there with you, standing beside you. That's what the armour bearer said. And so they step out together. Watch as God then gives them that sign by listening to the response from the Philistines. God gives them that sign as they climb up, that the door is open for this. Now notice that Jonathan was not being irresponsible. Some people have said that about Jonathan in this. He was not being irresponsible. He recognised the stirring of God in him, and he was stepping out in it, but he was looking for God to open the door, yeah, and to give him confirmation that this was the right thing. And he said he would not act. In fact, he said, we'll stay down here, the bottom of the valley. He wouldn't act unless he received that. Good things to do. Yes, respond to God, but listen for the way God wants to do it and how he will confirm you're on the right track. That's roughly what it would have looked like for them. Yeah, it's not the deepest part of the valley, it's actually towards the pass. And they would be climbing up towards the left-hand side. This picture is taken from the other side. Yeah, they would be climbing up that. Not too easy, is it? And I often quote, and in myself I remember, there's a great missionary, in fact Andrew was talking about the great missionaries in the rest of the world earlier. Hudson Taylor often said, in every good work of God, there are 3 stages. Stage 1, it seems impossible. Stage 2, it is so difficult. Stage 3, it's done. Do you notice there's no stage in there where it's easy? Impossible, difficult, 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 for however long that goes on, and then it's done. Well, it's not easy for these two. It's a long, hard slog up there. And it says they had to go up on their hands and their knees, just to emphasise just how tough that was. Yeah? Dragging themselves up to face the enemy. You know, you sometimes think, I'm just going to march out and face the enemy. Not always as easy as that. Facing the enemy can be a tough thing. Yeah? They had to go and find the enemy and go to them. You notice the enemy wouldn't come to them. They had to go and find them. And perhaps they stopped. I like this picture. Perhaps they stopped sort of halfway up. Can you imagine them stopping halfway up and looking up at what's to come and taking a breather? Sometimes you've got to do that, haven't you? In the work of God, take a breather and reconsider what you're doing. Yeah. It wasn't easy, it was really hard. And the enemy, we heard a little bit from Angela a bit earlier, did all they could to instill fear and doubt into Jonathan and his armour bearer. You can only see this guy at the top, fully armoured, you notice? And he's jeering at Jonathan and his armour bearer. They mocked them, tried to intimidate them. Ready for that? This is what will come. Mocking, intimidation, saying, we're huge, you're tiny. To tell them how tiny they were compared with the great enemy. Here are the Israelites coming out of the holes where they'd hidden, almost saying, why don't you go and hide again? Yeah. You see, the enemy were themselves overconfident. They were confident that Jonathan and his armour bearer didn't represent any significant threat to them at all. But they didn't understand the power of God, did they? You know, even today, inside the EU, there are whispers of people saying, that's fine, England's left, we can do without them, we're going to be fine. It's no threat to us. You see, in that climb up on their hands and knees, God was testing their commitment, Jonathan and the armour bearer, when the going was tough. He was testing their feelings of vulnerability as they saw the enemy at the top of the hill. Testing their feelings of being a bit out of their depth, but testing their trust in God. But can you, please try, imagine, what did it feel like to the armour bearer? Because I can almost imagine the confidence that Jonathan had, but what did the armour bearer feel? I think he felt, perhaps Jonathan will change his mind and we'll go down. I think that would have been my reaction. Perhaps he'll change his mind and it's not a good thing to do. But they don't. They carry on upwards with what God has called them to do, and up they go. And Jonathan takes his fight to the enemy and begins to kill them. And that wonderful part that shows you that the armour bearer doesn't just stand watching, but he takes part in killing the enemy. They kill about 20 of them, yeah? And just to quote another famous missionary, William Carey, what does he say? The famous William Carey statement. Expect great things from God. Attempt great things for God. One of the rules of William Carey's life. Expecting great things from God, because that's what the Word of God teaches us, but attempting great things for God, when everything else makes us fearful and doubt and so on. And these two, Jonathan and his armour bearer, they were truly attempting something great for God and his people, just as we should. You know, isn't it wonderful how God takes our simple acts of obedience and service and somehow multiplies them into a glorious victory? I just always remember that story in John 6 of the young man with his 5 loaves and 2 fishes, giving them to Jesus and saying, that's all I have, you can have them. And what does Jesus do? He feeds at least 5,000 men, let alone women and children that are there. Yeah? So it is with this story. God takes obedience and commitment by Jonathan and his armour bearer, adds the power of heaven into the mix. And what happens? In that enemy camp, from this small skirmish almost that we've just talked about, God creates an earthquake and confusion and trembling in the enemy camp. They are in terror. That's what God can do when we step out in what he asks us to do. And they say their neighbours were fighting each other. In other words, within the Philistine camp, they were even fighting each other. You wait and see that happening. You wait and see that happening. In fact, I've already heard whispers going on, in fact one in Switzerland. The Swiss saying, I think we perhaps ought to think about coming out of the EU. And Italy, I've heard it Swiss say it, I've heard the Italians saying it, I've heard in the Netherlands, I've heard it in France. So there are 2 sides already. Those are trying to pull themselves together, and the other side saying, well, I don't know, perhaps we oughtn't to continue with this EU thing. Already, 3 days after our vote. It won't stop there. So just one responding to God's prompting by Jonathan, and just one courageous standing up by that armour bearer with him, causes a total defeat of multiple thousands of soldiers, causing them to turn and flee. As Angela said earlier, this is not an economic or political battle, although there are aspects of that clearly. This is a spiritual battle, which is a much, much bigger battle that's going on. There is an economic and political battle, there's no doubt about that. So let's not deny it's not there, but there's also another one, a bigger one. And that one has by no means hardly started. And so, let's go back to that vision. You know, I was saying to God, okay, you've given me 2 different things here. You've given me this picture of the bowl with oil in, and you've given me this story in Samuel, Jonathan and his armour bearer, and I understand how you now saying it reflects on this instant in history, and you wrote it 1,048 years before Jesus. Wow, amazing. So let's return to that. And I love these conversations with God when God says, yeah, okay, have a look at this. He took me back to the picture again of that bowl with the oil in it. But this time, as I looked at it, I saw the hand of God move across the top of the oil. And he touched the top of the oil with what appeared to be like a stick, a flaming rod or a match of some sort, and suddenly the whole surface of the oil burst into flames, burning quite fiercely. Now, if that was a lamp, you wouldn't let that happen, because that's not how a lamp should burn. But a whole bowl of oil certainly did. And then God said over these flames, he said, I want at this time, sorry, I didn't mean to do that, I want at this time to set my fire upon them, me and you, to light the oil of my spirit, so that it will burn fiercely and strongly within me and you. I want each of my children to become a beacon of my fire and a flaming sword in my hand. What did the Saul's army not have? Correct. God's saying, okay, now, you understood the historical story? Use it to realise it applies today. But now, in this spiritual battle, you can have swords. In fact, you can have more than that, can't you? You can have the whole armour of God, which is? Oh, thank you. Shield. Sword of the Spirit. Exactly. Everybody hear all those? Did you get that? Helmet of salvation, breastplate of righteousness, shield of faith, sword of the Spirit, belt of truth, feet shod with the gospel, with the good news of Jesus. That's what we can have in this battle that's coming. Yeah? And this was the hard bit for me. Because at the end of that statement, God then said, almost as though he had tears in his eyes, but where are my armour bearers? I think he said that because, and I thought, you didn't ask where are your Jonathans. I thought God knows where his Jonathans are, who have already made that decision to stand up and fight and be moved by God. But God was saying, I know those people need armour bearers to support, back them and work with them. You know, this is, as Angela has already said, this is a hugely significant moment in your life and mine and that of the whole of our nation. I think we're getting that message, aren't we? You know, after this battle, it was at the start of Saul's reign. And Saul reigned for 40 years. So this was in year 2, 38 years left. It says, if you read on through the rest of that passage, which I won't go through at the moment, I haven't got time, it says, throughout his reign, Saul continued to battle with the Philistines for the whole of his reign. Here we are in just year 2 of his reign. Here we are today in just year 2. We have a huge battle, and I don't know how long that will go on for. You might say until Jesus comes back, I suppose, really. But the point is, it's going to be a real hot battle in the near future. And I'm reminded of what Mordecai says to Esther. Do you remember what he says? He says, Esther, who knows that you aren't called to the kingdom for such a time as this? And I'd like to say to myself and to you, you are called at a time like this. In fact, you are called at this time. Yeah? Into this scenario. Because it's just the start of the battle. Because the time has now come for action. Angela mentioned the Church of God being quiet or silent. That isn't what has to happen from here on in. Because this is a spiritual battle, not just economic and political, and it requires the people of God to stand up and take their place. Yeah? So I'd say to you, if you feel you're already one of those great warriors, great, then I say to you, climb the hill, go make your mark on the enemy then. Go do it. But if you feel you are only like a armour bearer, then I say to you, go and stand beside other men and women of God who are going to attack the enemy. And go into battle with them. And commit yourself to the work. And they're talking to me as well. Commit yourself to the work also. And above everything else, God does not want you just to be part of the audience. Especially at this time. And you know, move on from there. Oh look, there was the burning oil. That armour bearer can have a sword. Excellent. You need to pray, God, let me take my part. And just as God met Jonathan and the armour bearer as they stepped up to the plate, yeah, so it's going to be for you and for me. You know, there's a lovely old hymn. It says this. What have I got it on there? Oh, yes. Remember that hymn? Let me burn out for thee, dear Lord. Burn and wear out for thee. Don't let me rust. Or my life be a failure, my God, to thee. Use me in all I have, dear Lord, and get me so close to thee that I feel the throb of the great heart of God until I burn out for thee. You know, there's a call of God starting right now. And it starts with me. And I guess I've been into it since Wednesday. There's a call on me and there's a call on you. It says, will you now stand up? Will you now become an armour bearer and not the audience? Will you actively commit yourself to say, God, I will join in the battle? And I know what you'll say because I say it to myself. You'll say, what battle? Which battle? What do you want me to do? Where have I got to go? God's not wanting you to know that right now. He's wanting before that the commitment that says, when I call, you will stand. When he prompts you, he wants you to know already that you will stand and take part. As a challenge to me, but it's also a challenge for you. On Wednesday, I believe in the hall here, was it Wednesday or was it last Sunday? Oh no, I think it was Wednesday. I don't know how it started, but in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 8, it says, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And I said, yes, Dave?
Here am I.
Here am I, send me. If you want to know how to face the future of what is going to happen with fear and frustration and anger, you know, and worry and everything else, intimidation, the battle that's going to go on. That, God says, is the secret. That the people of God will stand up and say, here am I, send me.